Back to this morning, coming up after 11 this morning, 100,000 members, dozens of country houses and miles of coastline to look after. We're going behind the scenes of the National Trust, chatting to its new director for Wales, Justin Albert, here after 11 o'clock this morning.
But first, it's the second part of our series celebrating Welsh explorers with the scientist and explorer Hugh James from Blackwood. Lovely to see you again, Hugh. Welcome.
Good morning, guys.
Last week we looked at the life of George. I like to call him Everest now.
Yeah, I find myself doing that.
I've been amazing. Well, not exactly amazing, but I've been intriguing people all week saying, it's not Everest, it's Everest. Well, I never knew that. Yeah. So, thanks for that.
Makes sense.
So, George Everest, who was born in Crickhowell, we chatted about him last week. Today, it's a Welshman who is arguably one of the great scientists of the 19th century. Who are we chatting about today?
And the great scientist of all time, Alfred Russel Wallace. Yeah, he's been cropping up a lot lately.
Yeah.
In different bits and pieces. The Astronomical Society are naming the new planetarium after him, the new observatory after him as well.
Let's talk about his early life and life before work. He grew up in Monmouthshire.
He did, yeah. His father was Scottish descent, because his name was Wallace. I think everyone with the name Wallace claims that they came from the descent of William Wallace. I think all Scottish people try and do that. And then his mother was from a middle-class family in Hereford. So he wasn't of Welsh descent, but he was born over in Llanbadach. And he was the seventh of 9 children. That's quite a few.
Yes.
As was the case then, big families. Working life, he was taught map making and surveying, all of which would come in handy much later. It was a good apprenticeship, his working life, for what he later became famous for.
Yeah, he went over to Hereford to go to school, but because of financial difficulties, he had to leave certain schools and then move to London and went to others. So up until he was about 16, he moved around quite a lot, but had quite a good upbringing and quite a good education. But then he got into, between 16 and 20 then, he didn't really know what to do with himself, and he kept moving around. He ended up, when he was 20, back in Neath, working for his brother's company, which was a surveying kind of engineering style company.
Mm-hmm.
So
and how long did he stay there? Was that something that he pursued for quite a while, or did he have itchy feet? Was he off quite quickly?
Well, do you know what? He was one of these people who were quite late into the whole exploring and scientific game, because he seemed quite happy over in Neath, and he was living with his sister as well. And he didn't really kind of go off exploring until quite late. He actually worked when his brother William died, and he tried to take over the company, but the company didn't work. So he went to work for, they proposed a new Vale of Neath railway, and he went to work as a surveyor for them, which he liked, because it got him outdoors, and he started collecting different specimens from the great outdoors, and that's how he first started getting into what's it called? Stuff. Insects.
Insects.
Do you know, I've been in Cyprus the last couple of days. I can't speak English anymore.
That's all right. That's how he got into insects.
And then a whole new chapter opens. This guy who's surveying Welsh railways suddenly takes off to foreign climes, and in particular off to Brazil, where he spends the next 4 years of his life collecting his specimens, looking at all these species, and it is the start of a new life, isn't it?
Yeah, he started reading different books when he was working in these different places, and he read one called "The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation," and he really got into Charles Darwin's work and Charles Lyell's, and he really got interested in how all this different stuff works. And Alfred Russel Wallace was one of these people who was interested in the world, not just science, not just, well, we call it science now, we think of physics, biology, chemistry, but the natural sciences, everything that makes the world work and the universe work, he was interested in. And I think nowadays we get too hung up on, you've got to do one particular kind of thing. And nowadays, because we are so far along the scientific track, we kind of have to make new discoveries, we have to specify our interests, I suppose. But he was interested in absolutely everything. So we got into what we now call biogeography. So looking at how different species around the world, where they come from, what they're doing, how they interact with each other. And went off to Brazil, to the Amazon River, and spent a good 4 years out there collecting species and collecting them and making notes about them and bringing them back home.
And was this trip what sparked his interest in the idea of natural selection? You think that was...
It was definitely the starting point for that, because he was a big believer in something called transmutation, which was and he wrote about it in one of his papers, where one species, when one species grows up, we say it grows up when it evolves, and another species grows off it. The two species, they don't kind of pop out of nowhere. They kind of, one comes from the other, kind of like that, and that's transmutation. They just don't spring from nowhere. And that was like the basis of natural selection and evolution.
He was an extraordinary collector, wasn't he? I mean, he collected over 125,000 specimens, in particular, on this period between the 1850s and 1860s on his travels through the Malay archipelago. I mean, that is quite some collecting. It's almost obsessive.
He was said to be one of the greatest collectors of all time. It didn't always go well, because out in Brazil, when he was in South America, he collected all these species, and coming home on the ship burnt down, and he lost nearly all of his all his collection that was on the ship. He lost all his notes. He lost. They all managed to survive and get back to the UK okay, and he sent some home from America earlier on, but everything else he lost. So it didn't always go well. But when he was out in the Malay archipelago, he actually collected 125,000 specimens of, and most of which, about 1,000, were new species.
Goodness, that must, I mean, at the time, I mean, that's incredible, isn't it, to be able to do that? I wondered, were his findings and the new species he was finding in his work, were they sort of celebrated at the time, or is it not until many years later it's sort of, society looks back and thinks, oh, actually, this Wallace guy, made a big impression? He
was a very, very modest man. And also because of the time, he spent a lot of his time out on expeditions, out exploring different places, a lot of time in Singapore, in Indonesia area, and correspondence from place to place often took months to get back and forth. So where people like Charles Darwin were kind of based in the UK, developing their theories, and could go out and do talks and kind of build up a bit of fame, in inverted commas, he couldn't. He used to send his papers, of which he wrote hundreds, back to Charles Darwin to forward on to people like Charles Lyell, and then they would send them out to be published, or they would send in correspondence back and forth to each other. So as well as being a very modest person, he didn't have much PR and marketing.
Yeah, it sounds like Darwin was kind of the face of all the almost intelligence that was coming back to the UK from explorers all over the world.
Yeah, I think you're right. And most of the stuff in Darwin's research, he references to other people, and more often than not, it was Alfred Russel Wallace.
Yeah.
And there is this great industry, isn't there, suggesting that Darwin perhaps lifted Alfred Russel Wallace's ideas. I mean, that simply isn't true. I mean, the shipping documentation suggests that isn't true. But I mean, they were on the same page at roughly the same time, weren't they?
And Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace themselves say that their actual theories were very, very similar and almost identical up until they came to some different conclusions. Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace differentiated in one or two things, the biggest of which was natural selection through kind of the way that different species interact with each other on a sexual basis. So sexual selection and stuff like that. Darwin really kind of believed in that, and Alfred Russel Wallace didn't believe in it so much. So the conclusions were different, but the theories were much the same.
Yeah.
But there was an article a couple of days ago came out saying that Charles Darwin has been given the limelight, really, in saying that he didn't actually lift any of this material. That they definitely influenced each other, sending letters back and forth.
Did they ever meet each other, do we know?
They did. Yeah, they did once or twice when Alfred Russel Wallace was back in the UK.
And were they rivals, or were they, sort of collaborating?
Different people say different things
about
this. And one of the reasons that they kind of conflicted a lot of time was because Alfred Russel Wallace was a big believer in spiritualism. So he believed in...
Which was very big in this period, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, it
definitely was. But in the scientific circles, it was very much frowned upon. But that's one of the things about Alfred Russel Wallace, is that he always kind of believed the more radical ideas, and always kind of sided on those because they were normally the things that came out to be true.
It's one of the interesting things about exploration, isn't it? That when you think of all the great discoveries, there is a name associated with them, but then you wonder about the contribution that other names have made to that great breakthrough, who perhaps have always been overshadowed and almost forgotten as we build up the brand and the name, whether it be, Everest or Wallace. Wallace has disappeared off the radar, really, because of the legend of Darwin.
Yeah, and when we talk about evolution, we call it Darwinism and things like that. And there's been no one that's been more influential on biogeography about when you look at a map of the world, where different species come from, where most of the mammals are, where most of all the other species are. He was the founder of all of that subject and was the co-discoverer of natural selection as a part of evolution. So he was one of the greatest scientists of all time.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Did men like Wallace lead, I suppose, solitary lives in as much as did they have big, a big entourage with them when they travelled, or was it just a small band, or were they on their own? And did he ever have a family, or was his life his work?
Wallace was one of these ones who, unlike George Everest, who we talked about last week, did a lot of the stuff by himself or with friends. When he went out to Brazil, he went out with one of his friends and met up with his brother out there as well, but did a lot of this stuff by himself. When he came back to the UK, he did actually marry. He got engaged at one point and then that broke off, which a lot of people say that's why he started getting into spiritualism, but then he did remarry as well. But he spent a lot of his time then, up until he lived till he was 90 years old, which is a great age to live to. He died in about 1913. So he lived a long time and got to see a lot of different things.
And what should his epitaph be? How should we remember him?
I think we should remember him as a great contributor to the natural sciences. Because, like I said, it wasn't just biogeography, it wasn't just evolution. He did stuff in astrobiology, wrote about the Martian canals. He got interested in the canals on Mars, and Percival wrote about them, and then spent 10 months researching it just to publish a paper on it. In his lifetime, he wrote 22 books and 747 short papers on everything from socialism to astrobiology to evolution. And I couldn't, if I sat down now and wrote for the rest of my life, I don't think I could write that much. So a great contributor, I think.
It's an extraordinary story. Hugh, good to see you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Guys.
The scientist and explorer Hugh James on the life and times of the Welsh explorer Alfred Russel Wallace. And next week we'll be talking about the life of Henry Morton Stanley, the explorer of Africa, who found David Livingstone, saying, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." That's next week.
Vets can put your pets at ease in the most extraordinary ways, acupuncture being one of them.
They seem to find it a relaxing experience.
But sometimes the most patient of patients needs to let off steam. Find out what it's like on the front line of animal healthcare in Wales.
Anyone who likes zits and things like that, vetting is the job for you.
Vets 24/7 continues Wednesday at 7:30 on BBC One Wales.